Mr. Lee Howell, Head of Global Programming, also in charge of the annual meeting 2017 taking place in Davos, and been responsible for Davos in the past as well. Bringing all the stakeholders together, the program of the new Davos, I read, begins development a day after the previous one ends. And every year there's a theme, and the theme for 2017 is responsive and responsible leadership. So we need strong leadership for the obvious reasons, but except for that, why did you pick that theme?
I think there's two contexts to consider. If you speak to most leaders, they say, the challenge is there's so many urgent things to deal with, yet, how do we give attention to the important things? And I think that's a sort of a classic way of leadership. How do you frame between urgent and important? But if you ask those who are relying upon that leadership, I think most people, and I include myself as just a citizen, would say, well, we actually need you to respond to some things, and and we need you to do that very quickly, but also in a very responsible way. And I think that's the dynamic we're in today. In parts of the world, there's a political rhetoric that's built around being more responsive. But if it plays out in a policy terms, we then become concerned about populism, nativism, or even radicalism, because that would be the response. So embedded in this theme is the notion of, yes, I think there are so many issues and require real, true leadership, real vision, real change. But at the same time, it has to be done in a responsible way. And that responsibility more and more is intergenerational. I mean, it means that things you do today will have outcomes not in your political cycle or your company's quarter or year, but it's going to have repercussions further down the line. So we have an intergenerational element of being responsible. And I think that notions of leadership today you have to be indeed agile and responsive, but when you respond, it has to be in a responsible way that thinks not just in the near-term considerations, but actually factors in long-term considerations.
Right, you mentioned policy, and I know in the WEF annual meeting 2017 overview, it is written, and I quote, "In the end, leaders from all walks of life must be ready to react credibly and responsibly to societal and global concerns that have been neglected for too long." So Davos is the biggest platform, or one of the biggest platforms, I should say, where leaders from different countries come together to discuss and tackle different issues. And you mentioned this policy. So how can we ensure that we move from talks to policy, from dialogue to action? And after all these years, what is Davos really changing? Do we see that change?
I think it all begins with being more deliberate and actually being more evidence-based. I think first and foremost, you can rush into a lot of things and you can then regret a lot of things you've done. Leaders do that, we do that as people. So I think the first thing is to actually do a much better job of defining what the problem really is before jumping to prescribing a solution. I think we would all appreciate it if we went to a doctor, same thing. We'd really want to know what the nature of the problem is. And that requires what I would call the diversity of thinking. You need the other stakeholders. And if you see an issue and from your vantage point, it may seem clear, but it may actually be a muddled picture because you're not seeing its totality. So you have to bring, if it's a global issue, you have to bring all the stakeholders, get that global perspective and from other disciplines, then start from there and say, well, what's the common interest? What is the problem we're all looking at, what we see? And then move from that interest to finding a purpose among the group and action. Now, the annual meeting enables all three. In certain cases, it just highlights what is that shared common interest. In other cases, it is able to sort of nudge and drive people to get to find a purpose because they are,
and they do, right?
They do.
They do.
In fact, and in other cases, they actually lead to action. And we see of some of the initiatives that have come around in terms of initiatives that
do you have one that comes to mind?
Well, I mean, the ones, some of the most interesting ones across the lake when I think about this is the work that was done to really deal with vaccines, in terms of the development of the Global Alliance against the Global Alliance for Vaccines. And among other things. I think what's interesting to me the most is that when you get very committed people to at least spend some time together to think about what the real global issue is, and global in its sort of broad terms, and also in its very narrow term. What do I mean? I mean, global where we think about it is clearly international, but global in the sense that if you deal with the issue, this issue, that it will have an impact across a number of countries and societies. I think you can get somewhere, and I think that's the premise, and that's really been the purpose of the World Economic Forum.
All right, allow me to I want to get the most I can out of these questions, so if I interrupt, I'm sorry, I'm not being rude. Another important gathering other than Davos, is of course the UN General Assembly, which takes place every year in September. And earlier this month, the European Council President, Mr. Donald Tusk, spoke about how the EU had a difficult year, specifically after Brexit. Now, right before the UN General Assembly at an EU summit in Bratislava, he said, "Many people, not only in the UK, think that being part of the EU stands in the way of stability and security." Now, if the UK makes it out of this Brexit okay in about 2 to 3 years, what would that mean for the future of Europe? Can other countries follow in its footsteps? And if they do, what would it mean?
Yeah, I would. This is really, truly, I think, a complex issue in the sense that it's going to be nonlinear. I don't think we're able to sort of say you do X and you're going to have Y outcome. Right. In most instances, there's the unintended consequences of every, along that we only realize as we sort of in a way iterate through the process. So we don't really at this stage know what until really the United Kingdom really gets serious about discussion on the Article 50. We don't really know how this plays out. But let me just say about principles. I think the big issue is openness or closedness. I think around the world is the notion of how open will you be in terms of, again, how the economy works, how your society functions, open to ideas, and how much are you not going to be, and to what degree are you going to try to stem certain parts, certain ideas, and certain activities. What everyone's missing is, whichever camp you're in, the reality is we're a very interdependent world. In fact, probably the most interdependent time in our history, in our daily lives. I mean, we use mobile devices. Well, these are global systems that are connecting us. I mean, if you're relying on your device to even navigate through the streets, you're looking at a global system that is actually enabling that. So we're living in this very interconnected world, and I think it does bring questions of control. How much control do we want to have, and at what level? And also issues of what is identity. How much of your identity is global, how much of your identity is national, or in your community that you live in. I think those issues are very real. I think you have to acknowledge them. I think in a way, Brexit and what it represents is the dilemma people face today, recognizing on one hand that they do indeed live in a very interdependent world, often enabled by technologies in their everyday lives, but at the same time, trying to preserve their sense of identity as certain decisions are being made or consulted upon in different venues. Some national, some very local, and some regional or international. And I think that's what we're trying to sort out at the moment. And why I mention that is that however things evolve with Brexit, the issues and concerns that it surfaced, and be it in the UK, it was a very slim majority. Nevertheless, I think they surfaced those issues, and all parties need to sort of look at what led to that.
Another major issue that we're seeing today, and you mentioned this idea of control. Europe's most powerful leader, Ms. Angela Merkel, said a little bit after the elections that took place that she felt that she had lost a bit of control with the refugee and migrant crisis, which we're seeing now impact Europe. And I know that you were a consultant to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and I wanted to ask, this is a problem for Europe today, and again, it was spoken about at the UN General Assembly, and they said that they want to spend billions to keep migrants in Middle Eastern refugee camps as opposed to letting them come to Europe because it may not be the best solution. Is that a solution?
I mean, there's two big issues here that we have to get our hands around, and it's very unfortunate that people are suffering on account of not being able to grapple. One is basically conflicts that seem to not get to any closure or end state. In a way, they just continue to simmer on or even boil up and then simmer back down.
But no end in sight.
Because my experience, it was when conflicts ended and we were focusing on the repatriation and reintegration of the refugees into their communities. But that's not the case here.
That's the nice part.
That's it. That means the hostilities have ceased and people can return back. We don't have that situation. So there's an issue, one of just conflict resolution. Like, how do we actually put an end to a number of conflicts throughout the world? One good story that maybe a signal is what recently happened in Colombia and the treaty and the fact that there is, looks like a road to peace. The other side is just a larger issue of migration, and exacerbated by two trends. I mean, the population trends, we're going to get more people on this planet. And if it happens to be that with more people, the number of people increasing, that the temperature, climate change, and we do approach 2 degrees warmer in the planet, we will have people migrate not because of conflict, but because really of environmental forces that necessitate that. And we are seeing already, in putting aside internally displaced persons, but we see in most societies, rural communities moving into cities, and the cities not being able to cope with that. And that has nothing to do with conflict. I would even say at the moment that it's not even being driven by the environment, but by economic opportunities. But the capacity of those communities, the cities, to absorb that is very difficult. It's very challenging now. Now add to that the scenario that I just rolled out. So we have to deal with it. I think there's two issues. One is it's a tragedy that people are suffering on account of the fact that we haven't been able to find the means to resolve conflicts. And at the same time, we haven't really anticipated the fact or planned for the fact that people will have to migrate on account of demographic environmental forces. That will happen independently. So what we have to do now is take this as a wake-up call, work on the urgency. People are alive, people are suffering daily, and we have to deal with that crisis. But we have to acknowledge that we need longer-term solutions here, because let's hope, and I really hope, let's hope that there is peace and that people can get back and settle and rejoin the communities. The fact of the matter is that there'll be others who will be leaving, trying to actually escape either the poverty or the politics or the environmental challenges.
But are those numbers as big as when there is conflict? I mean, when there's conflict or interstate conflict, the numbers tend to be huge, in the millions, in terms of migration.
Well, no, I mean, if you look at most people in conflict areas, they're actually displaced within.
Right, displaced within.
But what I'm talking about is, if you take the scenario of any large country, let's say in the Sahel or in Central Africa or North Africa, if you have water stress, you literally don't have the means to support agriculture, support industry, because of the absence of a resource that you can't substitute.
Right.
You move. You have to move.
Right.
Where do you move? You can move to a city or another locality, and you'll stress that locality. And eventually, if it is really systemic, the problem is systemic, meaning it is, let's say, linked directly to, attributable to climate change. You will not get to the place you need to be in terms of to be able to sustain your livelihood and the community until you probably cross another border, maybe multiple borders, maybe even an ocean, a sea, and this is what we anticipate. So the point is that we have, what we're seeing today is a real human tragedy. It's really the shame of the 21st century, right? This is the biggest refugee displacement challenge we have since the Second World War.
Since the Second World War.
And yet we're not really making progress on it. But
any recommendations for the MENA region? Middle East, I should say, mostly been affected by this.
I think in all instances, the countries need to identify what they have more in common and less what they have not in common. Because at the end of the day, be it demographic forces I mentioned or political forces, we need more tolerance, right? If you want to coexist, then you have to establish some thresholds of what in terms of not allowing intolerance in many levels, because that's the only way. If the neighborhood's getting smaller, then you have to figure out how to live in the neighborhood together. That's
the solution to the future.
Well, I wouldn't say it's a solution. It's a path. It's a principle.
Them.
I mean, it's in a way solutions. I mean, you have to start with some, I think, fundamental notions about the design of the solution, and that is that you have to sort of build it on certain things. And I think one thing, the more resilient, lasting solution is one that's built on tolerance and acceptance. I think will be much more adaptive and flexible than one that isn't. Because right now we're seeing the other side. We're seeing if you go towards intolerance and non-acceptance, this is the problem.
We're running out of time, so I just want to end with one last question. On a personal note, because I know you've been taking care of Davos for 16, 17 years, has it been?
Well, I've been with the World Economic 15 years, but yes, I've been doing this about 10 years now.
All right. And any Davos memory that comes to mind that you can share with us?
I think the most powerful moments are when you witness people sharing something in a way that transcends your profession, your generational differences, your geographic differences. And some of the greatest moments for me have been around arts and culture, where I see everyone smiling, clapping, and they could be very different. It could be competitors in industry or different views in politics or from different generations. So, most of the moments that I have had that stayed with me are when I've seen really beautiful expressions of art that's around trying to promote unity, that highlights what's common with us and what we as all just human beings find as inspiring and beautiful. Those are the moments. So strangely enough, you've described the World Economic Forum as very much in a very important geopolitical, geoeconomic institution. But what I find most powerful in that is when we're able to have moments where arts and culture rise up and sort of remind us all what humanity is about. And that, I think, is probably the best reality check you have when you talk about these issues, is to sort of appreciate, we're all humans. And the goodness. And if you don't start there, going back to your comment, if you don't start with that baseline, then I don't know. I think you can have solutions, but how long lasting will they be would be the pertinent question, right? If you don't have a vision of the future that you're celebrating together, that I find it difficult to keep things, from falling apart if you don't have that.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Lee Howell.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.